Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is once again a reading of Player vs. Player by Reyna on AO3. This is a violent work of fan fiction, so if you don't like that or if it's triggering for you, I would please go do something else. And without further ado, please enjoy my reading. Thank you. Hello everybody. This is Chapter 9 of Player vs. Player by Reyna on Archive of Our Own, and I hope you enjoy it. When Marcy had been deemed fit to be discharged from the hospital, and she'd managed to weasel out of her the location that Sasha was being kept at, Anna had expected a bit of resistance. A high-security prison wasn't exactly a place you just let foreigners waltz around in willy-nilly, especially not if they had a personal connection with one of the highest-profile prisoners there. She had underestimated just how much political clout Marcy held. She'd known, on some deep subconscious level, that Marcy had a lot of responsibility and, as such, would have the privileges associated with such a position. She didn't know that Marcy outranked pretty much everybody but the king and council, respectively. A carriage had taken them from the hospital to the prison in 4 minutes flat, and upon reaching the place, the carriage door was opened to a procession of guards, 2 deep on all sides. The prison itself wasn't a terribly remarkable building. It was tall, certainly, but carved from all the same light gray stone much of the surrounding buildings were. The only indication that the building was anything other than another government one were the large double doors, each made of a thick-looking metal, and with various chains and wrenches on either side. It would take a team of 6 fully grown newts on each side just to crank them open. A green newt stood at the doors, a nervous, yet polite smile on his sweat-soaked face. Marcy hardly even bat an eye at the spectacle, and strode through them with all the confidence of someone born royal. "Master Marcy," the newt calls, bowing low upon her approach. His eyes shifted over Marcy to briefly glance at Anne, and he almost face-plants in an attempt to go lower. "And Lady Anne, to what do we owe the pleasure?" Marcy's posture is perfect. They'd always been about the same height, her, Mars, and Sash, but in recent years, Sash had started to gain a couple inches on the 2 of them. You wouldn't know that from Marcy's posture now. She looked like a different person, tall and imposing. Nothing like the little girl who went on 1-hour-long rants about her current favorite video game. When she looked down at the newt, her gaze was sharp, and her expression unyielding. "Captain Marcy will suffice." The newt rises back to a standing position almost too quick to follow. His hands meet in front of him, ringing together nervously. "Of course, Captain Marcy. To what do we owe the pleasure?" "You have a prisoner that King Andreas wanted me to speak with." The newt's eyes widen and quickly dart between Marcy and Anne, trepidation beginning to dawn. "I don't believe that I've already done the paperwork." Her voice is clipped, brittle, no emotion, and little patience there to hear. Anne feels like she is intruding on something she isn't supposed to see, a side of Marcy she hadn't known existed. She reaches into her cloak, an item she had retrieved almost immediately after waking up, and tugs out a wad of papers Anne had no idea she'd been carrying, or when she'd had the time to do so. The newt takes the papers with shaking hands. Some sweat drips from his brow, down his face, and off his chin. He barely even glances at them before nodding his assent. "Of course, Captain Marcy." He bows once more, nearly glancing their shoes with his nose, before turning aside and muttering a hurried order into one of the guards' ears. As the doors are cranked open, Anne can't help but press herself a bit closer to Marcy's side. Her eyes quickly dart to her, and she's relieved that they are the same dark charcoal she'd always known. "What is it?" Just like that, the act is gone. Her face, once carved from stone, is soft again, and her voice just as concerned and gentle as it always has been. It was terrifying, to be honest. The shift from one persona to another, and going by the genuine curiosity on Marcy's face, she hadn't even known she'd done it. One of her brows rises, concern beginning to furrow her brow, and Anne bites her bottom lip. What was that all about? She decides on. That question is safe, at least. Marcy just continues staring at her, confused, then glances back at the newt who is busying himself with ruffling through a desk in a small alcove. Before I started doing stuff for the night guard, I didn't have a technical rank, but King Andreas had already granted me access to pretty much everything in the kingdom, so they started calling me Master. I don't think it's very appropriate for me to keep using the title now that I have one of my own, especially if we intend to get out of here eventually. Anne blinks a couple of times, confused. Why? Marcy's face takes on a warm color, and she reaches up to ruffle the back of her hair. Utopian court structure is pretty similar to a British royalty and inheritance rights and stuff. Anne is still lost. Okay. More color takes up Marcy's face, and she glances around again. Once more, all of the newts are currently occupied. Master is usually the title given to the head of the house's heir. Anne takes a second to process that. Are you a prince? No, Marcy hisses, still plenty pink in the face, and spares one more glance to make sure they haven't attracted any unwanted attention. Seeing no wayward glances, she focuses on Anne. Not technically. That's not a real no, Anne thinks. But before she has time to voice that, the green-skinned newt from earlier has re-emerged. The doors are now open, exposing a long, winding hall of cells and gray-bricked walls. Every 10 feet or so, a guard stands at attention, a spear in their right hand and uniforms polished to shine. The newt clears his throat nervously. If you'll follow me, we'll go into the locker room where you can deposit your weapons before I take you to the... Deposit my weapons? Marcy cuts him off, and the mask has fallen over her face. Any sign of the Marcy she knew is gone. One hand crosses over to rest against the crossbow mounted on the other. The newt's hands rise in surrender, his eyes wide, ringed with white. It's standard protocol. She's not a standard prisoner, Marcy snaps. And Lady Anne and I aren't standard visitors. She trails off and casts a meaningful glance at Anne's left side. The newt visibly pales at the implication. I don't trust her in a room when I don't have a weapon. There will be guards stationed just outside, and how can I trust they'll be fast enough? Anne doesn't like the energy Marcy is emitting. It feels dangerous and fragile, like the slightest provocation could easily shatter her brittle voice into something sharp enough to kill. We passed our last inspection with flying colors. You're employed in the inner city, are you not? The newt swallows, audibly. Yes, Then you'll know that your department is currently under investigation after this latest incident. Marcy sweeps her gaze over all the newts in the room, forcing each to avert their gaze in shame. I do not trust your inspections or your protocols. My weapons will remain on my person. There is a beat of silence, a beat of challenge. Marcy stands tall and still, waiting to shoot down any argument. Anne carefully rests her hand on Marcy's shoulder. Marcy, I really don't think that's a good idea. The defensive posture deflates, replaced with a slightly betrayed look on her face. But you know, I know what Sasha is capable of, Anne finishes for her. But I also know what you are. I don't think it's a good idea for anyone in that room to have access to any kind of weapon. She glances down at the newt, who still looks like the slightest breeze might send him running. You have already searched her? She asks, not unkindly. He visibly relaxes underneath her gaze and clears his throat before speaking. Of course. Other than the sword she had, a dagger and 2 smaller hunting knives. All of them have been turned over to the Academy as evidence. Anne nods and then casts her gaze back to Marcy, who still looks unsure. We'll be fine, she assures. Marcy bites her lip and clenches her cloak between her fingers. You're sure? Anne nods. She sighs. Fine. Lead on. She's cold. They'd taken her weapons, her armor, her belt, her boots, and then left her in a cell with nothing but a tank top and trousers. Winter is approaching. It's cold. The walls are gray, a color just a bit more on the blue side, and there are exactly 62 bricks from wall to wall. The entire cell consists of 19,210 bricks, one wall taken up by the cell door and another sporting a small window she can just barely fit her fingers through. She knows because she counted them herself. It's big enough across it takes her 5 paces to reach each wall, but it's square in its shape. The cell door is 10 rows high, with 15 columns across. She can fit her hand through the bars, but only up to about mid-forearm. She'd gotten her hand stuck earlier, trying to test that limit. The thing is, she really doesn't know what she's doing here. Is she a prisoner of war? A fugitive? She's not technically a part of Amphibia, just loosely aligned with the Toads, and that's up in the air right now. What the hell is Grind thinking? As far as he knows, she disappeared right after receiving a direct order to stay away from Utopia. Does he think she betrayed him? Has she? She doesn't know. It's cold. Footsteps are coming down the hall. She'd received meals in the past few days, but hadn't bothered trying to eat them. She hadn't been able to keep anything down while she was at camp. Just because she'd had a change of scenery didn't mean she'd suddenly been able to eat. Anne screamed. It was loud and high, and rattled what little remained of Sasha's sanity inside of her skull. She'd stumbled back even as the door to the hospital room was all but ripped off of its hinges, and the room was flooded with bodies. Someone was holding her back, pinning her down. She didn't care. Anne hadn't stopped screaming. The footsteps stop in front of her cell, and if she wanted to, she could easily look up to see who it is. She stares at the adjacent wall, counting the bricks for the umpteenth time. The guards will remain down the hall. Just shout if you need anything. The warden tells her visitors, and then the metallic door creaks open. Sasha closes her eyes. What does she look like, she wonders, now that she's fallen so far from grace? Her skin is pale and thin, pulled taut over her bones from malnourishment. Her hair is stringy and unkempt, from weeks of neglect and the elements. Her clothes, the little she has, are tattered. The trousers hang from her hips like the only thing keeping them up is spite alone, and the tank top has worn so thin she can see her ribs through them. She's covered in bruises, and scars and nicks here and there from sparring sessions and assorted encounters living in Amphibia entails. She must look so small, underwhelming, weak. Her hands ball into fists, and the cell door is closed. She can hear her heart beating inside of her chest, the blood roaring through her ears. She feels like she's going to burst. She's so cold. Anne didn't stop screaming. so very, very cold. Not even as she was dragged away. The breath in her lungs feels like ice. It burns when she exhales. There was blood on her bandages, underneath her nails. It dropped to the floor. The crimson color was so very, very familiar. She can't breathe in. She couldn't breathe. She can't breathe. She had been choking on her tears and her sobs. She couldn't breathe. Sasha punches the wall. It hurts. She takes a breath. Her hand hurts, but she can breathe. Something hot runs down the back of her hand. It's sticky. Comforting almost in its familiarity, even if it's hers. A laugh pushes past her lips and she almost chokes on it. It tastes like smoke. God, has she really sunk to this level? Sasha? Slowly, ever so miserably, she drags her gaze upwards to meet the very bane of her existence. She should have known she'd come. Anne's expression is sad, and she's resting on her knees in front of her, hand resting on Sasha's knee like she's trying to comfort a crying child, like she's the one in power, like she's safe. Some sick, demented part of Sasha wants to grab that hand and wrench it back painfully just for having the gall to assume that she won't hurt her. It's the same part that had screamed at her, that had demanded that she make it even. Sasha feels nauseous. She doesn't have anything to throw up. She's hardly been able to keep any water down. The blood on her knuckles is thick, and her mouth has been dry for several hours now. Anne's hand tightens slightly when she doesn't get a response other than Sasha's listless gaze. "Can you hear me?" she asks, gentle. Everything about her is so painfully, agonizingly gentle. The curve of the bridge of her nose, the slope of her cheeks, the softness of her eyes. Her tongue darts out and licks her lips nervously, and something an awful lot like want spikes through Sasha's chest. Sasha feels the sudden and violent urge to scream. Of course, that's why. "You shouldn't be here," she manages to choke out. Something almost like relief flashes over Anne's face at her response, and she shakes her head. "I had to check on you after I told you to make it even." A beat of silence. Sasha revels in it. "You should have done it." Anne stares at her, eyes wide with disbelief. Then she closes them, retracting her hand, and tugs in a deep, calming breath. "You don't mean that." Sasha wants to be insulted. "I do," she insists. "I could have killed—" "I know." Anne cuts her off, rather abruptly, but her eyes are still shut. She takes another deep breath. "I know." Sasha waits for more explanation, but gets none. Eventually, she decides to take matters into her own hands. "Why am I here, Anne?" Anne's eyes pry themselves open, if only to settle her with a somewhat confused look. "Am I a war prisoner?" she clarifies. "Or am I just to be tried for aggravated assault? I'm not exactly a Newtopian citizen, though I'll admit I'm not sure how Newtopian law works." "Maybe you should have brushed up on it before deciding to go to war with them," another voice remarks dryly. All of the blood in Sasha's veins turns to ice. She knows that voice. Twin green flames dance before her eyes a shadow cast around them by the cloak pulled low over her attacker's face. You. Her jaw is sore, but she snaps her head upwards despite it. She looks the same she did the last time she saw her. Skin pale and tired rings beneath her eyes, but there's a quality to her face she doesn't recognize. It's sharper, harder, deadlier. Her boots give her a couple extra inches, and the utopian coral armor broadens her shoulders. When she looks down at Sasha, she can't help but feel so very, very small. Do you have any idea just how much shit you're in? Marcy! Anne remarks, sounding mildly offended, and it would be funny if Sasha didn't feel, suddenly, like she was going to find something to expel after all. She spares a glance for Anne, and her entire person softens for a split second. For a moment, the girl that Sasha had known is back, the one she used to poke fun of for her clumsiness. Then her gaze snaps back to Sasha, and any sliver of warmth is gone. As a prisoner of war, you are held as collateral, or a bargaining chip, as to be determined by your commanding officer and my king. It is in my best interest you be cooperative, otherwise She trails off, and Sasha could swear her eyes flashed green for a second. Can't guarantee your safety. Marcy, Anne remarks again, this time less of an exclamation and closer to an admonishment. Her hands come up in a gesture like surrender, but her eyes are not in the motion. They bore into Sasha and pin her to the wall. Just stating the facts. Anne lets out an exasperated huff and reaches up as to pinch her brow, only to find nothing to pinch it with. She ends up lightly bonking herself between the eyes. Not helping. Vaguely, Sasha can feel her hands creeping closer together, but it feels distant. Everything feels distant, like she isn't quite connected to her body. They're arguing. She can see their mouths moving. She can hear the words, but they don't have meaning. They wash over her, a tidal wave of senseless noise. Anne's arms are moving. She's gesticulating wildly. She is still and motionless as a mountain. Her dark eyes never leave Sasha. Her hand hurts. Aches, stings. Her nails are digging into the ragged skin that tore when she punched the wall, pulling at the flesh and eliciting sparks of agony. She doesn't care. The pain isn't registering. Nothing is registering. It feels wrong. Why? Why can't she move? Why can't she stop herself? Why can't she say anything? Why can't she apologize? Why can't she stop fucking pulling her hand apart? She's breathing, but she didn't tell herself to do it. Her nails are wet, but she can barely feel it. It feels like she's been shoved back from her body, like there's a screen between herself and world, a passenger in her own body. Anne and her are still arguing, too caught up in it to notice that Sasha's not quite there anymore. Where is she? What's happening? What the fuck? Her nails catch on something, and with much more effort than should be necessary, she manages to look down at her hand. It's a mess of blood and torn flesh, the ragged edges of torn skin giving way to black-tipped veins. The tips of her fingers are stained with blood, some parts thicker than others, giving them a splotched effect. Something blood-soaked is poking out of the flesh, her nails having unearthed it from the skin and muscle. Her fingers trail against it, wiping away some of the blood. It's white. It's bone. Dimly, she's aware it isn't good. Dimly, she's aware that she should probably stop poking at it. Dimly, she realizes she's probably severely hurt herself. She doesn't care. Sasha! It doesn't feel real. A hand grabs her by her wrist and wrenches it away from the other. A spike of pain shoots up her arm, and she almost laughs because it feels so disconnected from her. It doesn't feel real. Why doesn't anything feel real? What's wrong with her? What the actual fuck? Anne's sitting in front of her again, her eyes wide and horrified, pinpricks embedded deep within the whites. What are you doing? What is she doing? Her hand is in Anne's, but she can't move it. She can barely feel it. Anne's talking to her. Say something. React. Anything. Just like a person. When she moves, her mouth feels like it's operating a crane. Every movement, even the slightest motion, takes so much concentration, so much awareness. She can feel her tongue raking across her teeth to produce the words. The breath as it glides out from her throat, hot and tasteless. It hurts. Anne's brow furrows, and she glances at the hand that she's holding. Revulsion flickers across her face at the sight of the blood. No shit. She grumbles from somewhere over Anne's shoulder. Anne whips around to glare at her. Marcy, this is serious. She raises her hands again. I'm not saying it's not. She takes a couple steps forward until she's just over Anne's shoulder. She reaches for Sasha's bleeding hand. That hard and metal thing connected with her jaw once more, and she was forced to become acquainted with the taste of Newtopia's walls. Then a hand wrapped around her newly sore chin and yanked it back down. The fingers squeezed tight. All the muscles in her spine tense, and she's wrenched herself backwards. Adrenaline is sparking up and down her body with little regard to what she's going to do with it. There's nowhere to go, nowhere to run, and the adrenaline is there, but she can't fucking do anything about it because she isn't in her goddamn body. This is real life, Sasha! Her voice shook with volume, trembled beneath the weight of the rage she could feel pouring off her in waves. The white-hot fury that seemed to just coax the intensity of those venomous eyes until they bore straight into Sasha's soul. Real goddamn life. This might not be our world, but it is a world, and there are real. She lifted her hand and slammed her against the wall again. Lives. And again. At stake. And again. Her hands come up to shield her face. But she didn't tell them to do that. Her breath was coming in gasps that shiver and shake inside of her ribbed cage, but she isn't making them do that. Her teeth are chattering, and she can feel the impact as it rattles her eyes inside of her skull. Her hands are shaking, and she can see the blood dripping down the back of the left and the fingers of her right. She isn't telling them to shake. She isn't telling her body to do anything. She's left sitting inside of it, screaming desperately for something, any sort of semblance of control. But there is none. All she can do is watch as her body curls into a ball and cries.